Hashem melech, Hashem malach, Hashem yimloch be'olam va'el. 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 Hallel Hashem Elohim, v'yagadenu b'todah. Hallel Hashem Elohim, v'yagadenu b'todah.
Those guys are a lot of fun. That's the Y Studs doing their version of Hashem Melech, God is the King. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's Monday. We're back into the rest of our lives, having come out of this holiday period. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this lovely Monday? James Roth from Indianapolis, Joy Lynn from New Jersey, Hannah says Shavua Tov, Paula from Chicago, Pam says Shalom from Nashville. I love that song. John with us from Seattle, Steiner von Breitenborn from Delaware, Wilson says that Jasper, Joseph, and Wilson are here from Boston. If this is your first time joining our show, please let us know so we can welcome you. Let me straighten that out a little. Melissa is with us from Great Neck. Nancy says, woo, I'm finally here from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Carlos says, shalom. Sharon is with us from Lebanon, New Jersey. Shell Renee is with us from Huntsville, Alabama. Let's light up the darkness. Randy says, hey, hey. Chaim Burke is with us from Charlotte. Welcome everybody over on the YouTube side. Marasia Janut is with us from Atlanta. And a few more are joining as we speak. All right, we got a lot to cover. So let's just establish quickly where we are and get into it. We are in the third volume of the Talmud, that's tractate Eruvin. Generally, the rules of creating an area where we can carry on Shabbos, or extending or changing how far we can go or where we can go in terms of walking the maximum distance on Shabbos. And as I mentioned yesterday, it's like we're in chapter 6. We're discussing the first Mishna of chapter 6. And it took until chapter 6 to really get at the heart of what the Eruv is all about. And that's so often the case with the sages and Ravina and Rav Ashi, the way they organize the Talmud. They start us in places, they start the whole tractate, and they start chapters with what's of interest to somebody who really has a lot of knowledge already. And then if it's being taught, well, the teacher would have to explain a lot of basics, but it's really, collated, whatever. It's collected for the purpose of a very educated crowd, and they assume a lot of knowledge. And that's why it's really not organized like where we just start with the basic ideas and then move forward from there. And that's why we've had to explain a lot of sort of basic ideas as we went along. But now we're really into it. This chapter sort of takes us back to why the Eruv was created in the first place, right? So the idea is, it's not spelled out in the Torah. We know we're not supposed to carry because it's one of the 39 prohibited labors that were necessary to build the tabernacle when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness. So carrying objects is one of those labors. And on Shabbos, all the labors, the creative labors of construction, everything from actual construction to writing and weaving and dyeing, all those things are prohibited. And carrying especially is one that has impact. When you say that's prohibited, it's difficult. What does it mean that carrying is prohibited? Generally speaking, we can carry within our private property. We cannot carry in the public domain, nor can we carry objects from the private domain out into public, nor in the public domain back into private. And then those rules got an adjustment during the reign of King Solomon, who said, more and more people are living in cities, right? So it was not so complicated when most people were farmers, and even in the cities, people had sort of one family residences with one house per courtyard. But as the cities grew and became more crowded, more and more you had two houses sharing a courtyard, or three houses, or four houses. So now, even though the courtyard is private property, there's several houses that have rights in that property. And now, if you're going to carry from your house, which definitely is your private property, out into this courtyard where several other people have legal rights to carry, King Solomon said that's too similar to a public domain. And so all the people that live in that courtyard have to enter into essentially a spiritual partnership where they're going to join their rights symbolically by all of them depositing some food in a basket that is going to be stored in one of the houses of that courtyard. And now they've all joined their rights. It's as if they're all one family and it's all one residence, and so everyone can carry throughout that courtyard. And likewise, if several of these courtyards with multiple homes in each all open into an alley, and it's that alley that leads out to the main public thoroughfare, right, out into the rest of the city, then for people to be able to carry in that alley, they all have to join. The different courtyards have to join in an Eruv so that any of the people who live there can carry in the alleyway. And then they have to make certain adjustments as well to the alleyway. Now, here's the thing. There are certain people who cannot join in the Eruv. So even if they live in your courtyard, they're not going to join in the Eruv with you. Either a Jew who doesn't subscribe to the concept of Eruv, and this would be someone like a Sadducee that doesn't submit to the authority of the rabbis who created and extended the laws of Eruv, or an idolater, and the Talmud refers to them quite colorfully as star worshipers. So if you share a courtyard with a star worshiper, it's a problem because he can't join in the Eruv with you. What do you have to do? As we learned yesterday, you need to actually rent those rights from the star worshiper who lives in the courtyard with you. You don't have to do that if it's just one Jewish home sharing a courtyard with one star worshiper. But if there are two Jews in that courtyard, two Jewish homes, they would have to enter into an Eruv with each other. And now that they're creating that Eruv, they're going to have to get those rights from the star worshiper. And if he refuses to give it to them, that's going to be quite a problem. They may not be able to carry in their courtyard on Shabbos. And part of the reason for this decree with respect to the star worshippers is that as a matter of policy, the sages really didn't want Jews sharing courtyards, living with their immediate neighbor, somebody who worships idols and stars and natural phenomena, etc., someone who denies the existence and sovereignty of the one true God. Okay, so that's generally where we are. And yesterday, we sort of came to the end of that discussion, and we said there was a difference of opinion between Rabbi Meir in the Mishna, who said that even if only one Jew lives in that courtyard, the presence of the star worshiper or the Sadducee, as an example of someone who doesn't believe in the Eruv, would restrict the person from carrying on Shabbos. But it was Rabbi, Eliezer ben Yaakov, who said, no, there have to be at least two Jews who would need to form an Eruv themselves in order for the fact that their third neighbor in the courtyard, that star worshiper, would restrict them. And the law, as we learned at the end of yesterday, follows Eliezer ben Yaakov, although it was a little bit unclear whether the law follows Eliezer ben Yaakov or the custom follows Eliezer ben Yaakov, but it doesn't rise to the level of the halakha, the law, or even, well, that's what the people do. They, generally the custom has arisen, even though it didn't issue from the sages. It's not the custom of the sages, but the custom arose among the people to follow that ruling of Eliezer ben Yaakov. And so it was unclear whether his ruling became the law or the custom, or just kind of a custom followed by the people. But then we got reinforcement again that, yeah, it's the law. The law follows Eliezer ben Yaakov on this question. And just remember that if you didn't have the situation of the star worshiper in that courtyard, let's say there were 4 Jewish homes in the courtyard, if 3 of them joined in the Eruv, but the 4th didn't, then none of them would be able to carry in that courtyard on Shabbos. They all need to join in the Eruv. And if the one in the 4th house was going to join and then he forgot, that's a big problem. Now nobody can carry in the courtyard. But even on Shabbos, though it's too late for him to join in the Eruv, he could make a bittul. He could relinquish his rights. He could nullify his own rights, so he wouldn't be able to carry in the courtyard, but then everybody else would. So that's just some background on how this setup works. And here we are in chapter 6, and on this question of whether the law actually follows Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov or Rabbi Meir, as you know, the two of them had a little bit of a difference in the Mishna, as I just spelled out. So then that we were talking about, so how authoritative is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's ruling? Abaye said to Rav Yosef, now meaning that Abaye, who would become a great sage in his own right, when he was younger, he was a student, a disciple of Rav Yosef, who was not only his teacher, but the recognized authority in this region of Bavel, of Babylonia, in the Jewish community in Babylonia. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, oh yeah, well the teachings of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov are few but clean, meaning he doesn't have a lot of rulings in the Talmud, but wherever we find a ruling of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, everybody follows it. I mean, unless there's some reason where it's spelled out in the Talmud that we don't follow Eliezer ben Yaakov's ruling, generally speaking, whenever we come upon one of his rulings, we follow it. Now, Abaye said that in front of his teacher, and this was inappropriate. And now we're going to get into a rather long digression on respecting and maintaining the honor of one's teacher. And recall, this is a system, the system of the oral law, which is passed down by the sages very much from teacher to student. And they took the honor of one's teacher very seriously indeed. And that survives to this day. If you go to a yeshiva, where the oral law is being taught, there's a much keener sense of the honor of teachers. It's a typical custom in a yeshiva that when a teacher enters the room, all of the students stand up. It would be nice, I would think, if all schools did that, and perhaps it's something they used to do. And even I remember seeing this, a totally different tradition when I used to study Taekwondo, the Korean martial art. When we were on the mat, if a teacher came in, we stood up and bowed. If the Grand Master, the founder of the school, came in, he would get a lot of honor from all the students, including all of the black belts. So this idea of being careful, being very careful of the honor of one's teacher is the theme that we're going to be studying today. So the Gemara, as soon as it hears that Abaye spoke about, we always follow Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's rulings, and he said that in front of his teacher, Rav Yosef, so the Gemara asks, and may a disciple issue a ruling in a place where his teacher is the recognized authority? Not just his teacher, but even the recognized authority in the region. It's like so much worse to do that in that situation. So Rav Yosef said to Abaye, the great Rav Chisda would not issue a ruling on even something so basic as may an egg be cooked in kutach when he was in front during all the years of Rav Huna's life. So what is he saying? Rav Chisda was a disciple, so of a previous generation. Rav Chisda was a disciple of Rav Huna, right? So Rav Chisda became a great master in his own right, but when he was younger, he was a disciple of Rav Huna. During all the years of Rav Huna's life, Rav Chisda would not even issue a ruling on a question as basic as, can we cook an egg in a dairy dish, right? You can't cook meat with dairy, but an egg is not meat. You can certainly have an egg with dairy. It was a very simple, kind of basic question for the sages. But if somebody asked that of Rav Chisda, when he was in the area of Rav Huna, he would say, it's not my place to issue a ruling in the presence of my teacher. Ask my teacher. And if his teacher authorized him to answer questions, then of course he would. But he was just showing that kind of honor, that if somebody came to him with a question, he'd say, it's not my place to issue a ruling when I'm in the presence of my teacher. The Gemara then comments, well, actually, Rav Chisda did issue rulings in Kafri during the life of Rav Huna. But what is the difference, of course, is Rav Huna was not present. Kafri was a more distant city. So when Rav Chisda was over there in that city and people had questions and they came to him, he couldn't say to them, go ask my teacher, because his teacher was far away. So, in that situation, sure, Rav Chisda could issue rulings. And then Rav Chisda's student, Rav Hamnuna, so this is another example. Rav Chisda, who issued rulings during Rav Huna's lifetime, but only when he was in another city. So Rav Chisda's student, Rav Hamnuna, did the same thing. During Rav Chisda's life, Rav Hamnuna would never issue a ruling in Rav Chisda's presence, but when he was in another city, namely Charta de Arges, so there he would answer people's questions and issue halachic rulings. He would make rulings of law, let people know how they're supposed to conduct themselves, because he couldn't refer them to his teacher. Ravina and Rav Ashi, now we're going to have an extended discussion about them, and they're sort of the last of the Amoraim, the last of the sages of the Talmudic era, later than the Mishnaic era, and they would actually become the editors of the Talmud. So everything that's set out in the order in which it's set out, the way that the Talmud is organized, is the work of Ravina and Rav Ashi. They were also a pair. They learned together and with each other, but Rav Ashi was the senior sage. Rav Ashi was older, was originally the teacher of Ravina, but Ravina, they weren't so far apart, and even Ravina was a little younger, they essentially became colleagues. So it was like Ravina was a disciple colleague of Rav Ashi. So a story is told that Ravina once examined the shochet's knife, so the knife of the ritual slaughterer, generally of cattle and sheep and other creatures, right? So for meat to be kosher, it needs to be shechted. It needs to be slaughtered properly. There's a lot of laws about that. We'll encounter them later in our journey through the Talmud. But one of the laws is that the knife has to be perfect. It has to be extremely sharp and not have any nicks in it, so that it can make a perfect cut across the tubes in the throat of the cow or the sheep that is being slaughtered, also a chicken. And so periodically that knife would need to be examined by a halachic authority, a sage who is an authority in this kind of law, would examine the knife and say, yeah, the knife is good, you can keep doing your work. So Ravina once examined the shochet's knife in Bavel, in Babylonia, during Rav Ashi's life, right? Now, this seems like that's a pretty big region, like somewhere in Babylonia, presumably near Rav Ashi, enough so that Rav Ashi said, do you think it's correct that you examined a knife when I was nearby? Do you think that was the correct thing to do? And Ravina answered, well, and didn't Rav Hamnuna issue rulings in Charta de Arges during Rav Chisda's life? And Rav Ashi says, well, actually, it was stated that Rav Hamnuna did not issue rulings during the life of Rav Chisda. Ravina says, no. The way we've learned this, like together, maybe even the way I've learned it from you, is that we have two traditions. Rav Hamnuna did not issue rulings during the life of Rav Huna, who was his primary teacher. So during the whole life of Rav Huna, Rav Hamnuna did not issue any rulings, any halakhic rulings. And they probably were dwelling in the same area, and so he would never issue a ruling as long as Rav Huna was alive. But after Rav Huna died, Rav Hamnuna did issue rulings that were during the life of Rav Chisda. So you can get this order. It was Rav Huna was a teacher of Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda was a teacher of Rav Hamnuna. So Hamnuna would never issue a ruling in the presence of Rav Huna, the sort of senior teacher of his generation, but he did issue rulings while Rav Chisda was alive, as we have learned. And now Ravina says to Rav Ashi, and the reason that he felt he was able to do that is not so much the geographic question, but rather that Rav Hamnuna was a disciple / colleague of Rav Chisda. In other words, Rav Hamnuna was not so much younger and so much junior in sort of learning and respectability and authority than Rav Chisda. And he says, and likewise, Ravina says to Rav Ashi, I'm your disciple, but I'm also your colleague. In certain areas, you rely on me just as I rely on you, and we learn together. It's not that you're 20 years older than me and I defer to you in everything. People see us not only as master and disciple, but also as colleagues. And the halacha is that in the that when it's a proper master-student relationship, you don't issue rulings during that person's lifetime unless they're very far away. When it's this disciple-colleague relationship, you would never issue a ruling in that person's presence, and in their presence includes reasonably nearby, like 3 to 5 miles away type of thing. But further away than that, like you're in one town and I'm in another, okay, so then Ravina would feel free to issue rulings in another town while Rav Ashi is somewhere else, and that is considered okay, at least according to Ravina. And Rava also said that in terms of examining knives, the knife of a slaughterer, a Torah scholar may even examine a knife who's just a disciple. He's not at the level of his teacher at all. But if it's only for his own use, that he himself is going to slaughter an animal, okay, then he has enough knowledge that he can do that for his own use. He just can't issue rulings where other people are going to come to him and ask him if the knife is okay, when properly they ought to be going to his teacher for those rulings. And there was an incident that illustrates this. The Gemara relates that Rabbi Eliezer from Hagronia and Rav Abba bar Tachalifa happened to come to the house of Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, in the place of jurisdiction of Rav Acha bar Yaakov. So several sages were at someone's house. A few sages got together at the home of one of the sages, and they were in the jurisdiction of the great sage Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Let me get it right. And they were in the jurisdiction of Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, wanted to prepare for them a third-born calf, whose meat was considered a great delicacy. So he brought out the slaughtering knife and he showed it to his colleagues. Now, Rav Abba bar Tachalifa said to them, should we not be concerned with the respect of the elder? We're in the area where the established authority is Rav Acha bar Yaakov. We should take the knife to him and let him say that it is approved and ready for use. And we should present the knife to him for inspection, as this is his town. Rabbi Eliezer from Hagronia said to them, well, that's unnecessary since we have this teaching of Rava that a Torah scholar may examine a knife for his own use. Rabbi Eliezer from Hagronia then inspected the knife, but he was later punished by the hand of heaven for disregarding the honor of the senior rabbi. So the Gemara expresses surprise. What was Rabbi Eliezer from Hagronia's mistake? He relied on that ruling of Rava that a Torah scholar may examine a knife for his own use. these guys were gathered together. They examined the knife. They did the slaughter for themselves to eat that third-born calf. Didn't Rava say a Torah scholar may examine a slaughtering knife for himself? And the Gemara answers, it was different there, as they had already begun to discuss the issue of the honor of Rav Acha bar Yaakov. In other words, they didn't need to show him the knife, but once they discussed that we could show the knife to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, they should have. They should have taken the opportunity to go to the master in his dwelling or his synagogue or wherever he was located and show him the knife and ask him to make the ruling. It wasn't necessary, but it was the right thing to do. You know, you go out of your way to honor great scholars, great possessors of wisdom. It's a compliment to them. And as Abraham Lincoln said, everyone loves a compliment. Had the name of Rav Acha bar Yaakov not arisen in the conversation, they would have been permitted to examine the knife themselves. But once his name had been mentioned, they should have approached him with the knife, and the failure to do so is considered a display of disrespect. And if you wish, say instead that Rav Acha bar Yaakov is different, as he was a truly illustrious sage. He was really renowned in his era. As a great master and super, possessing great wisdom. And they should have taken the opportunity to go visit him and given him the opportunity to make a ruling on their behalf on that knife. Okay. So great is the care. Great is the care that the sages instruct us to take with the honor of great scholars, great Torah scholars, of great scholars, great sages, great teachers. Really honor them and go out of your way to honor them. Rava said, however, even having said all of that about how careful, how far out of our way we need to go to honor the great ones. However, even in the direct presence of one of our masters, of one of the great sages, if we need to speak up in order to prevent a person from sinning. In other words, somebody's about to make a mistake, and the example given is that they were learned, who was it? As in the case where Ravina was once sitting before Rav Ashi, right? So Ravina is this disciple colleague, but he would never make rulings directly in the presence of Rav Ashi because he's a disciple colleague, right? Disciple first. So he would never issue a ruling in the presence of Rav Ashi. However, they were sitting together and they saw somebody come up and was about to tie a donkey to a palm tree on Shabbos. And the sages had issued a ruling that we don't make use of trees on Shabbos. So it would be incorrect. You'd be violating a rabbinic prohibition. Rav Ashi didn't see it. Ravina saw it. The sin, the prohibition was about to be violated at that very moment. So Ravina spoke up and said, hey, we don't do that. We don't tie donkeys to trees on Shabbos. Tie it to something else, not a tree. So he spoke up and made a halachic ruling, gave a warning from coming to sin. What is the result? He shouldn't have done that, but he did it, right? So if a scholar, a Torah scholar, issues a ruling in the presence of his master, what is the punishment? What is the result? What is the consequence? So Rava says, one who issues a ruling in the presence of his master will incur death at the hands of heaven. We don't impose a death penalty on a person, but if you disregard the honor of your teacher, heaven does not like that. Heaven does not like that. Heaven imposes a hierarchy, and just as we respect the Lord in all things, the Lord expects us to respect our teachers here on earth. And when we disrespect our teachers, heaven doesn't like it, and it can happen that a person, has his life shortened. That punishment is death at the hands of heaven. And according to Rava, and this applies if one issues a ruling directly in the presence of his master. If he issues a ruling in the, in the region, like where he should have referred the question to his master, who's not right in the same room, but somewhere nearby, the punishment is not, it's still prohibited, but the punishment is not death at the hands of heaven. And the Gemara says, "Oh, really? Are you sure that it only applies when when the master's in the same room and not nearby?" But Rabbi Eliezer taught that the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, in the wilderness, the ones who brought strange fire into the tabernacle and lost their lives. Right? So recall that Aaron, Moses' brother, he had 4 sons. 2 of them died in one shot right after the instructions were given by God, and Moses supervised the construction, and the tabernacle was erected, and they inaugurated it, and it was amazing, and everybody was celebrating, and everyone was so high on it, right? And Aaron was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and his sons were the priests, right? Always the descendants of Aaron are the priests in Judaism. So the first priests were, Aaron was the first high priest, and his sons were the first priests. So the 2 younger ones, Nadav and Avihu, they were so enthusiastic, right? They loved serving God. They absolutely loved God. There was nothing rebellious about them. But in their enthusiasm, they brought strange fire onto the altar. Kind of when they were alone at night, they weren't even bringing offerings on behalf of the people. I think they wanted to get in there and do some more. Sometimes we have a tradition that says they were anxious. They wanted to, already take over from their father and their older brothers. Some say they just wanted to be closer to God. What did they actually do? When the offerings were brought on the altar, they were slaughtered first, then they were put on the altar where they were burned up for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But when the Lord's presence was right there with the Jewish people in the wilderness, you never had to light it on fire. The offering, let's say a sheep or a goat or a bull even, it had already been slaughtered, its parts were placed on the altar, and then a fire would come from Hashem, from God. It would ignite the offering, it would burn up, and it would make a pleasing aroma to the Lord. They brought an offering, and maybe they weren't sure that God would light it up for them, so they brought their own fire. Now, what we learn here is that so they did that, and then they lost their lives. And they weren't burned up, but it was like something went into them and they died, right? Their souls were taken to heaven, and it was a national tragedy. I mean, 2 sons of Aaron, shortly after the tabernacle was inaugurated, now 2 of them are dead, suddenly dead. What we're learning here is that they weren't punished for bringing the strange fire onto the altar. What they were punished for is that they issued essentially a halachic ruling. They said, oh, well, even though God's fire comes down from heaven, we should bring our own fire, which actually is the law, and it's spelled out elsewhere in the Torah. But it was not their place to issue a ruling that had not been established clearly yet when Moses was nearby, because obviously the recognized authority among the children of Israel in the wilderness was Moses. And so his nephews had no place, making their own ruling of Torah law when they were in the area of Moses. Moses wasn't in the room. He certainly would have stopped them if he saw what was going on. But they issued a ruling when Moses was nearby, and indeed they incurred the punishment, death at the hands of heaven. So Rabbi Eliezer says, don't take any chances with this. If you can refer a question to your master, that's what you do. You don't issue rulings, not in his presence and not if he's anywhere nearby. Maybe if he's in another city. Okay, and Rabbi Eliezer also had the experience that a disciple of his issued a ruling in the direct presence of Rabbi Eliezer, and later he commented to his wife, Ima Shalom. We'll definitely be hearing more of her in the future. Here, she's just having a conversation with her husband, and he comments to her, my disciple so-and-so issued a ruling in my presence today. I'll be surprised if he lives out the year. And indeed, the disciple did not live out the year. He died at the hands of heaven. And so at that point, Ima Shalom, Rabbi Eliezer's wife, said to Rabbi Eliezer, how did you know that was going to happen? Are you a prophet? And he said, I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet. But we have a tradition that a student does not issue halachic rulings in the presence of his master. They're really bringing this point home. They're spending a lot of time on this point. But remember, this is in the context of a tradition. This is the study, this is the textbook, right? They're the study resource of a long tradition of teacher-student, 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 students that become teachers. And they're along with the teachings and the knowledge and the facts and the stories and the legends and the analyses and the basis of analysis and all the laws, they're also passing on the etiquette of how we learn. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, one who issues a ruling in the presence of his teacher deserves snakebite. And Zeri said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, one who issues a ruling in the presence of his teacher is called a sinner. And then they bring the example of King David. So King David was not only one of the greatest king of all time, perhaps, possible exception of his son Solomon, but he also was the composer of most of the Psalms in the book of Psalms. So he was also, a rather well-versed authority in matters of Torah. But his teacher, David, King David's teacher, was a priest. He was a Cohen, and his name was Ira Hayairi. Ira Hayairi. And we have a tradition that says that King David never issued a halachic ruling. Obviously, he was a king. He issued many rulings on what should go on in the kingdom. But he didn't issue rulings about Torah law during the entire life of his teacher, Ira Hayairi. And after Ira Hayairi died, then King David would issue Torah rulings, halachic rulings. And having mentioned Ira Hayairi, the Gemara now mentions that David, because he respected his teacher so much, and he happened to be a Cohen, so David, anytime that he would set aside the gifts for the Cohen, the gifts for the priest, it's part of the tithing process, he would always give it to his favorite priest, who also happened to be his teacher. It made sense to honor his teacher, who also happened to be a Cohen, happened to be a priest, by every time he had to set aside part of his own tithes for the priests, he would give that to Ira Hayairi. And the Gemara says, and because he did that, there was a famine in the land that actually lasted a few years. It was inappropriate for King David, who had so much largesse to bestow. Obviously, he was so wealthy. He was the king, that the tithe that would go to the priests was a large amount. And he should not have put all of that wealth into the hands of just one priest. He should have spread it around more than one priest. Because he put it all into the hands of one priest, it led to a famine. And from that we learn that when we set aside tithes, not only for priests, but also for paupers, right, for the poor, we shouldn't give all of our tithes that go to the poor to just one poor person or even one organization. We should spread it around and make sure that it's doing a lot of good. And that is essentially we're diversifying our charitable giving. All it says here is don't give it all to one person. It's inappropriate to give it all to one person. So it's not spelled out how much you need to spread it out, how many different people. Minimum is 2, not all to one person. But it seems to me, and I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that once you're spreading it out, you can give to more organizations, the ones that you think are going to do the most good. And since you can never be sure that any organization that's doing good is going to keep doing good, it's good to give to a few different organizations to make sure that what you've set aside as a tithe is really going to do good in the world and reach the people who need it. Okay. Also, Rabbi Eliezer says that one who issues rulings in the presence of his teacher loses his position of greatness, and the example given is Aaron's son, Eliezer, the oldest son who became the high priest after his father Aaron died. But he gave a ruling during the life of Moses. He shouldn't have done that, just like his nephews, or his brothers, just like his brothers shouldn't have made a ruling and relied on it and brought in that strange fire. What Eliezer did wasn't so bad. Some people asked a question and he said, God told Moses that, and Moses told us that such and such is the law. So he said it in Moses' name, but the fact is Moses was nearby and he hadn't been authorized by Moses to give these rulings. He should have referred those people to Moses. And so he lost his position of greatness. And how do we know that? Because after both Aaron and Moses died and Joshua took over the leadership of the children of Israel, and then it was Joshua who led the children of Israel into the promised land. And so whenever, there was a question, and the Torah spells this out, that when the political leader of the people will have a question whether they should go to war or not, they're going to consult the Urim and Thummim, this kind of, vehicle of prophecy that is in the hands, it's in the breastplate of the high priest. But it says that Joshua, we don't have any recording that Joshua consulted with Eliezer before going to war. So somehow it's like Eliezer was at that level of the high priest, but not at the level that his father had been. Somehow he was diminished, perhaps because he had been haughty and issued a ruling when he should have referred people to Moses. Rabbi Levi, now that we're talking about Joshua, says that Joshua also was diminished. He once spoke out of turn in the presence of Moses, and because of that, he merited to rule the Jewish people and lead them in their conquest of the promised land, but he never had children. And perhaps it's because he spoke out of turn in Moses' presence that he never had children, says Rabbi Levi. But that contradicts a tradition. I'm coming to the end, so if you have questions or comments, put them in now. I'm almost done. And so Rabbi Abba Bar Papa says that no, the reason Joshua didn't merit to have children is not because he spoke out of turn in Moses' presence, but rather because there was an incident when it was on the eve of the battle with Jericho, right? When they were about to enter the promised land, and the first town they had to deal with was Jericho. And on the eve of that, obviously Joshua had a lot on his mind and he made a few mistakes. So one thing is that he didn't make sure that the daily offering was brought. Another is that he neglected his own Torah study. Then an angel of God came to help them to sort of battle Jericho. He says, "You have nothing to worry about. We're gonna, we're gonna conquer Jericho with no problem." But while this angel was here, he reminded Joshua that he hadn't given the offering, that daily offering yesterday, and today he neglected his own Torah study. And Joshua asked him, well, which is worse? And the angel said, well, I showed up today. So that Joshua understood that it was actually a bigger problem that he neglected his own Torah study than that he didn't bring the daily offering of the day before. So then he said, oh, okay, well, I'll make up for that immediately. And so he, even on the night before a battle, he went to study Torah because it was an obligation. It's like all of us have an obligation to do Torah study, but a king or a general, a leader, they have to make sure to be doing their Torah study so that they have the necessary wisdom and enlightenment to lead the people in this conquest. So now he's studying, and in the midst of his studying, and he's a little bit nervous, he's distracted, he made a mistake, he's got to lead the battle the next day. Now he's making up the Torah study that he missed, and he made another mistake, which is that the Ark of the Covenant, was, so I guess because he was doing the Torah study, it had been moved, and it was out of its place. It wasn't in the place where it normally resided. And in the encampment in the wilderness, which they'd had for 40 years, and now they were, just finally entering the promised land, but they already had a tradition during those 40 years that whenever the ark was open or out of its place, or for some reason wasn't in the place where it's normally supposed to be, then it's like, then all the people would be aware of it. And when the ark was out of its place, it's like everything is suspended and everybody's very careful. We don't do anything. And one of the things they don't do is that husbands and wives don't have marital relations together. So according to Rabbi Abba Bar Papa, the reason that Joshua would ultimately die childless and wouldn't have children is because of his forgetfulness and the mistakes that he made that night. It caused all of the children of Israel, the 2 or 3 million people, depending on how you count them, and all the married couples among them, that they had one night where they were prohibited to each other. So nobody was engaged in being fruitful and multiplying. We discussed this yesterday, but here they're saying being fruitful and multiply, means one and the same thing. They weren't, trying to increase the population of Jews. And because he caused husbands and wives not to be together due to his error, his punishment was that he himself was not blessed with children. This is according to Rabbi Abba bar Papa. And then Rav Baruna adds in the name of Rav that yes, this is absolutely true, and you should never interfere with husbands and wives, who might have time to be together and be intimate with each other, even, whether they're having children or not. Like, you don't come between a husband and wife. And so this Rav Baruna teaches in the name of Rav that a person should never sleep in a room with a husband and wife, with a married couple, right? Because a married couple needs their privacy. And when they have their privacy, okay, so they can make love and make babies. But if another person is in the room with them, it will inhibit that, and they, won't be able to do that. And that's why it is considered vastly inappropriate to share a bedroom with a husband and wife. If you're a single individual, you don't sleep in the same room with a husband and wife. And Rav Yosef adds, and this is true even if that couple is during the time of the wife's cycle when they're not permitted to each other, right? So 2 weeks out of every 4 weeks, she's either in her menses or observing the clean days after the menses before she immerses in the mikveh, and then they're permitted to each other again. So during those 2 weeks, they're not even permitted to each other, but still you can't share a bedroom with a husband and wife. Even though they can't make love together, still their privacy, their intimacy is that important, and no other person should be sleeping in the same room with them. That's what we have for today. Let us inspect questions and comments. Bill Eldridge. Quick question. I know that the Talmud uses separate terms for idolaters specifically and non-Jews generally. So from these statements on what the presence of a star-worshipping neighbor, what can be learned out over what the presence of a non-Jew who isn't an idolater in the courtyard? Great question. Sets us up for tomorrow, because tomorrow there's going to be a discussion of people who shared an alley, and it doesn't say he's a star worshiper. It just says he's a non-Jew. I think that generally speaking, there's not going to be that big a difference, but it's unclear, right? So unclear right now. In the Art Scroll, it translates the star worshippers as idolaters. And in the Koran, let's see, how does it translate? The Koran translates as a Gentile. So it would seem that at least for Rav Steinsaltz, they're saying star worshiper, and it could mean, it just means non-Jew. Part of the reason for that, I mean, I've heard before, I haven't studied in this situation. I can't, don't hold me to this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that part of the reason that star worshiper is used in the Talmud in some editions, it's possible that, sort of in later centuries when the Talmud was being studied, where the Christian community, which was very small at the time that the Talmud was initially being put together, then they were much more afraid of the Roman Empire. But over time, the Christian empire, as it were, became very, very powerful. And so they didn't want to have terminology in the Talmud that might be considered offensive by the Christian power. And so rather than just say non-Jew, they said star worshiper, so that the Christians wouldn't be offended. Really what they meant was non-Jew, but they might have used that term sometimes in certain contexts to avoid having problems with Christian Rome. I've heard, but it's been a while since I heard that. Sharon Frant Brooks. I have been to weddings in Lakewood, New Jersey, where when a rabbi of note entered the wedding, the students of that rabbi would stand. It is not only at a class or school where that happens. Thank you. Great point, Sharon. It's not only at the school. That's just where it's more commonly found, but it's a beautiful sign of respect. And for sure, when we were at the Siyum ceremony here in LA, celebrating the 7.5-year cycle that we're in now, back in January when it renewed, and there were some very esteemed rabbis who were sitting up on the dais on the stage, and when they walked in, everybody in that room shot up. Everybody stood up, instantly. So it's definitely a beautiful mark of respect. Lucy Ram Johnson, it seems to me that the sages say that if a Jew has a non-Jew or star worshiper as a neighbor, they need to work at knowing them well and building a close enough relationship so that the non-Jew will be okay about the Eruv needs, not hostile nor afraid that this is sorcery. Absolutely. You're going to have to make that arrangement with them. And you're going to have to explain a little bit about your tradition so that they understand what it is that you're doing. So it's interesting. On the one hand, they're sort of promoting a policy that people just shouldn't live with non-Jews in their courtyards. But if they do, and this seems to be like a nice way to imagine what relationships should be like, among different peoples, where we don't feel a pressure to assimilate or adopt their ways, but rather, just like we're doing here, there's a lot of people of different religions in this kind of virtual classroom that we have, and we're, sharing how we do things, how we see things, how we believe things, and we're just openly sharing the information. There's no proselytizing going on here. It's just like, oh, this is how my tradition works. How does your tradition work? Very interesting. We have to share a common space. Can we work together so that everybody, as we mentioned yesterday, can be as fruitful as possible in their own tree and in their own mission, right? Everybody is a soul who came into this world to fulfill a mission, and we want to give everyone the best chance to be as fruitful as possible in their mission. And often that requires communication, good communication, friendly communication, constructive communication with our neighbors. May we all be blessed to have that kind of constructive communication, both with our physical neighbors and our virtual neighbors, right? This is such a divided time in our country. We've got to be able to have friendly relationships, learning relationships. We don't have to be swayed by views that we really disagree with, but we should be able to have constructive relationships, just as Justice Scalia had a great relationship with Justice Ginsburg. They were dear friends, even though, they could not have been more opposite in their beliefs, but they had a relationship that was very cordial, and was a great model for how we should all try to have friendships with people, even if we disagree with them.